Famine now present in 5 areas of Sudan in what a senior UN official says is a humanitarian crisis of staggering proportions. Millions are displaced, and the US now says genocide is taking place. So what's the world doing for the people of Sudan? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly by Thibault. In less than 2 years, civil war has brought catastrophe to Sudan, a crisis of immense scale that is only getting worse, says the United Nations. A new UN-backed report says famine conditions are spreading. Nearly 25 million people, half the population, are facing acute food shortages. Millions have been forced to move or flee the country, the world's largest displacement of people by conflict today. In its last 10 days in office, the Biden administration has announced the Rapid Support Forces, which has been fighting the Sudanese army since April 2023, has carried out genocide. So how is the situation worsening? Why are so many more people now in danger? And what's being done to end the conflict? We'll talk to our guests shortly, but first, this from Victoria Gatenby, and a warning: her report contains images viewers might find distressing.
After nearly 2 years of fighting in Sudan, the scale of human suffering is catastrophic. Researchers from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine estimate more than 61,000 people have been killed. 26,000 as a direct result of the violence, the rest from starvation and disease. The situation has worsened since the army launched an offensive to take back the capital from the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces in September.
December saw further escalation of the fighting, including in Zamzam displacement camp, with civilians killed and injured by artillery shelling and reports of those seeking to leave the camp being blocked from doing so.
The UN says more than 12 million people have been forced to leave their homes since April 2023. 8.8 million within the country's borders, another 3.3 million crossing into neighbouring countries, including Egypt, Chad and South Sudan. A global hunger monitoring system known as IPC says 5 areas are facing famine, and more than 24 million Sudanese will experience high levels of food insecurity by May.
Conflict and forced displacement remain the primary drivers of this crisis, exacerbated by restricted humanitarian access. Sustained violence and economic turmoil have disrupted markets and have also driven prices of staple goods to unaffordable levels.
Fighting erupted after a power struggle between the head of the army, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and his former deputy, Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, of the Rapid Support Forces. The United States accuses the RSF and its allies of committing genocide during their capture of most of West Darfur state. It says the group has systematically attacked civilians, targeting particular ethnic groups, and carried out mass rape. Attempts by the US, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain to broker a sustained ceasefire have failed. Sudan is now looking to President-elect Donald Trump for help.
We think President Trump is a deal maker. We would be there ready to strike a deal with him. We will be ready there to strike a deal with him. We are not coming to him empty-handed. We have our blueprint to engage with the US at all times.
As the conflict intensifies, more civilians are at risk. But so far, the international community has had little success in securing humanitarian access or bringing the fighting to an end. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's now bring in our guests from London. We're joined by Kholood Khair, who's a political analyst who specialises in research on aid policy on Sudan and the Horn of Africa. In Geneva is Dr. Mukesh Kapila, who was the United Nations resident and humanitarian coordinator for Sudan in 2003 and 2004. He was vocal about the atrocities he witnessed in Darfur. And in Senegal's capital, Dakar, is Adama Dieng, the African Union Special Envoy on the prevention of genocide. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us on Inside Story. Kholood Khair in London, if I can start with you. We have today one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, a war that's creating mass famine, as we've heard, and we'll be delving deeper into that in just a moment. But I wanted to get your reaction first to the US declaring and determining that the RSF and its allies are committing genocide in Sudan today. What do you make of that? And what do you think has motivated this decision now?
I think it's high time that the United States made this designation. We know that the US has been sitting on information about the atrocities being committed by the RSF for some time. The Raoul Wallenberg Center, the Yale Sudan Laboratory, and Observatory, the Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, all of them have released reports that say that those atrocities were committed effectively amount to genocide. So this is not exactly surprising. What is surprising is the timing. I think it's very interesting that the Biden administration chose to throw this grenade effectively in the Trump administration's way, because they are the ones who are going to have to deal with the diplomatic fallout, with also naming the United Arab Emirates and their engagement with the RSF.
All right, Adama, Dieng, your reaction as the special envoy, the African Union special envoy on preventing genocide. How do you view this decision by Washington, especially when the US itself, has been accused of facilitating severe human rights abuses and genocide in the Gaza Strip? What difference do you think this determination is going to make in Sudan?
Well, it is very sad. I mean, although we have been seeing horrors being committed the last 21 months in Sudan, waiting today how to leave this current administration and to make a determination, while trying to say, of course, that they have been deliberating for many months, to me is kind of, I would say, game. But the situation is very serious. We are not allowed to play with the lives of the Sudanese. The Sudanese people have been suffering for so long, and I myself have raised this issue with many African leaders, reminding them about their responsibility. It was in 2000 when they agreed that never again they will allow genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes to be committed under their eyes. When they see the people facing that risk, they have the obligation to intervene. That is Article 4H of the African Union Constitution.
But Mr. Adama Dieng, if I can ask you, Mr. Adama Dieng, what will this US determination of genocide do effectively? Could it pave the way for additional international action? Does it put the onus now on the different actors in this conflict in Sudan, the UAE, for example, which has been accused of backing the RSF?
Well, I only hope that it will be a clarion call for all member states, all signatories of the Genocide Convention, about their obligation, their responsibility to prevent the crime of genocide. And as you know, this convention starts with prevention before even referring to punishment. So it is my hope that the report of Judge Osman of the Human Rights Council should serve as a starting base, because what he is calling for, awaiting the warring parties to stop, is the deployment of a neutral, independent force to make sure that civilian population are protected in Sudan.
Okay.
I mean, to me, it is very unfortunate, because what happened in Gaza, which is a genocide, and I made it clear in your TV at the time, and as a special advisor of the prosecutor of the ICC, I have been insisting also that the investigation be carried in a way to enable the prosecutor to get the evidence. And the same with Sudan. I warned both General al-Burhan and Hemeti about their responsibility. I asked it clearly to Burhan, where is Bashir today. He is in the darkness. And to me, what is extremely important is to make sure that the perpetrators of these crimes, once identified, investigation being carried on properly, be brought to justice. And let's not be taken as hostage, talking about truth, commission, etc. Yes, truth has to be done, but we need also to address the root causes of the situation in Sudan.
Indeed.
This happened 20 years ago.
Indeed.
Mukesh will remind us.
Yes, and let's bring in Mukesh on that, because Mukesh Kapila was indeed there in 2003 and 2004. Mukesh, I wanted to get your thoughts about the situation today and how it compares, of course, to what you witnessed when you were in Sudan, but more specifically about this U.S. action, Mukesh Kapila. When announcing the designation of genocide, Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, said that the U.S. does not support either side of the conflict, but he specifically pointed the finger at the RSF and its allies. And the RSF, of course, as you know, emerged from the notorious Janjaweed militias that committed atrocities in Darfur in 2003. How do you view this U.S. action, and do you think it's going to make any difference on the ground in Sudan today?
I think the U.S. statement is welcome in stating what I think most other actors had concluded some time ago. But it is politically too late, coming at the tail end of this administration. A point has already been made. And I think the U.S.'s ability to actually extract any action is so limited. And I honestly doubt if the Trump administration is going to make this a priority, at least at the beginning. To come to your earlier question on how is this different from 20 years ago when I was the UN chief there, well, the situation is far worse today than it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, when I shouted the terrible things that were going on in Darfur, it led to a Security Council resolution. It led to a referral to the International Criminal Court. It led to genocide, acts of genocide being declared and indictments being made. It led to UN, African Union peacekeeping forces on the ground. And while thousands were killed and hundreds of thousands displaced, and there's plenty of suffering, the genocide did come to an end. Today, none of the factors I mentioned apply. The Security Council is paralyzed. The superpowers are distracted. The African Union is worse than useless. I'm sorry to say, Adama. And I think we have an international community that is pulling at cross purposes in terms of people supporting different sides. And UN agencies themselves were fragmented.
Why do you think, Mukesh Kapila, why do you think the response this time has been so ineffective and ineffectual? Is it a case that the international community doesn't care about Sudan, or more a case, when you look at the humanitarian situation, for example, of not being able to physically get aid on the ground? What is the root cause of this neglect from the international community, you think?
I don't think the world doesn't care. I really believe that people around the world do care, in Africa, elsewhere, around. Decent-minded people, and there are plenty of them in the world as well. And the media has been paying more attention as well in recent months. No, I don't think it's that. I think what it is that the options available to make an intervention are much more difficult ones. For example, on the humanitarian side, which is very germane to this whole discussion, I think, unlike previous days where the UN had more robust approaches, where it had a notification approach to getting aid into conflict areas of Sudan, they seem to have moved now to a permission-seeking approach. And because territories are contested, then even in RSF-controlled areas, the Sudanese armed forces, the de facto government, have to give permission before you can use ADRE and so on. So that's one thing. The UN is not bold enough. Secondly, I think not enough support is going to local humanitarian actors who do a lot of the lifting in all of this. That's one thing. And on the political side, I think the point is people are more interested in doing deals with incoming US presidents when the deal has to be done between the two sides. And that deal has to come from within, from civil society involvement, from the civilian-led peace processes, which I know are mentioned in passing, but quite honestly, nobody takes them very seriously. So a whole lot of political inconsistencies, as well as, I think, humanitarian cowardice on behalf of the international humanitarian system is playing into the fact that millions are on the verge of starvation in Sudan.
Okay, and I'll allow Adama Dieng to respond in just a moment to you saying, Mukesh Kapila, that the African Union has been useless and toothless in this crisis. But let me bring in Kholood first. Kholood, the famine, the UN says that famine-like conditions are now present in 5 areas of Sudan, even though the government has denied this. What do you know is the reality of the situation on the ground today? What can you tell us about what's happening on the ground? And do you agree with Mukesh about why the reasons behind this neglect, it would seem, from the international community?
I think, the institutional barriers that Dr. Mukesh laid out are all very valid, but I do think that Sudan is seen as a low priority area. And more importantly, it's, what is happening in Sudan is sort of refracted through the lens of allies of either the US or Russia, etc., in the region. And so Sudan is not really seen on its own terms. And we have seen very clearly that the humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan does not move political decisions. This, for example, genocide determination, was not made because, of anything that's happening on the ground necessarily, but more to do with the political dynamics in Washington. And what we have seen when it comes to the humanitarian aid, obstacles, in large part, the UN has created those obstacles for itself by recognizing one of the belligerent parties, the Sudanese armed forces, as the government, and therefore instituting a whole set of blockages for its own self. It is not moved, therefore, by the needs, the humanitarian imperative to act, but rather by some kind of state, member state, push towards having some kind of government in place.
So are you saying, Kholood, that the UN itself is obstructing this delivery of aid? Is that the case today?
I'm saying the UN is hamstringing its own efforts by recognizing one of the belligerent parties as the government. And this means that it cannot override any of the diktats it gets from, for example, Port Sudan. And of course, by that same token, the rapid support forces also want to be recognized as a government because they see this asymmetry. And now there's also talk of a rapid support forces setting up a government in their areas as soon as this week. And obviously, this genocide determination puts a huge dent in their ability to do so because their credibility is shot, and it has been shot with Sudanese people for a while. But any legitimacy they might be able to claw from the international community has been dented by this genocide determination. Had that been done earlier, I think we could be potentially in a better place in terms of standing in the way of what looks like the almost inevitable split of the country. Now, what I think needs to happen is exactly what Mukesh said. There are local actors on the ground who have been delivering humanitarian aid, but the United Nations, again, has the large part, really ignored them and has not leaned into the localization agenda as much as it should have. But the blame doesn't stop there. I totally agree with Dr. Mukesh that the African Union has been completely toothless. In many ways, it has also stood in the way of its own action, primarily by sort of capitulating, if you will, to the political interests of, for example, regional actors, especially in the Gulf.
Okay, let's allow Adama Dieng, the African Union Special Envoy on the prevention of genocide, to respond to that. Adama.
Well, it is very unfortunate that the African Union has been failing the people of Sudan when it comes to protecting the civilians. And you may know that at the time, IGAD even suggested a force to be deployed. But we all know that when we speak about the right of the African Union to intervene, it's not very clear whether it has to receive the go-ahead, the green light from the Security Council or not. But my own view is that had there been a strong political will to protect the civilian in Sudan, it would have been possible. We have seen in the past when in 2000, when Rwanda decided to deploy its troops to Darfur. And I think it is simply a shame that in this year, we are commemorating the 31st anniversary of the genocide perpetrated against the Tutsis in Rwanda, which prompted, in fact, the African Union in 2000 to adopt this very important Article 4H of the Constitutive Act to remain so passive. I mean, why this passivity? I mean, we all know that there are also regional forces around. We know that sometimes when it comes to making a bold decision, it is not that easy.
Right.
And that is why the chairperson of the African Union himself, during the commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the Peace and the Peace Council of the African Union, made it very clear, showing clearly the difficulties, not only regarding the relationship between the REX and the African Union, but also even the member states. And let's be honest, unless the African leaders at the upcoming summit in February look each other in the eyes and say, let's go back to our constitution, let's fulfill our obligation. Otherwise, history will judge, of course, those leaders who will be failing the Sudanese people again. And as a matter of fact, Sudan is a classic example. And this situation now is an indictment to our humanity, to our collective failure humanity to the people of Sudan.
Let me ask Mukesh Kapila then about the way forward. The IPC famine review is projecting that 5 additional areas in Sudan will face famine in 2025, and that there is a risk of famine in 17 additional areas. So what can be done now today? You've talked about some of the reasons, the causes. What can be done now to avert a further humanitarian catastrophe?
There are no easy answers, I'm afraid. I think first we have to, but a direction of travel is that the humanitarian and political tracks have to be dissociated. Now, it's a bit counterproductive for me to actually say that when we know that there are only political solutions to this crisis. But my point here is that by spinning out the politics and spinning out the diplomacy, both the US envoys, the UN envoys, and all the envoys of regional powers have actually made the situation worse. What we need to do is to go back to some of the tools that were deployed 20 years ago, when we had high-level humanitarian leadership, both within the UN and in the US administration, and maybe again in the Trump administration, which would focus on the humanitarian issues regardless of the political complexities. And the number one objective being to force the aid through in whatever way possible from all particular directions into the country, and that to make it the top priority. And then the politics will flow from that, not the other way around, which we have traditionally believed, because naturally that's what the traditional thinking is. I'm afraid hundreds of thousands are going to die, regardless of what we say, and we shouldn't fool ourselves in that. But I really do think we need to up the humanitarian act. And the UN Secretary General has not shown leadership in this particular area. And the new humanitarian coordinator, well-meaning as he is, and he still has a honeymoon, I do not think they're doing what they should be doing. And I think the US administration, the USAID, and the State Department should stop fighting amongst themselves and put the humanitarian agenda on top of the political agenda in the battle to save Sudanese lives, which is more important than saving the Sudanese nation.
Kholood Khair, do you agree with Mukesh Kapila that the humanitarian and political tracks need to be dissociated? We've heard also from the Sudanese ambassador to the UN a few days ago who expressed faith in the incoming Trump administration that the US would be able to strike a deal to end this conflict. Do you believe that this new administration will be more successful in brokering a lasting ceasefire?
So there's a difference between a ceasefire and peace. Do I think that the Trump administration can negotiate a ceasefire? Potentially. Do I think the Trump administration can negotiate a peace deal? Not very much. And the reason for that is that the Trump administration, in its first term, if we say the past as prologue, has not really paid much attention to Sudan other than through the lens of the Abraham Accords. And it will probably continue to do the same this time around, which means it will very much defer to US allies in the region, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates, to cobble together some kind of ceasefire deal. Now, that will by no means means that there's going to be any kind of peaceful resolution to this conflict, and it also means that most likely, civilian actors, democracy, justice, accountability, those things will be very much left by the wayside in favor of some kind of military deal. Now, even if that happens, I think what we've seen very much is that the US government is in many ways, up till now, not done actually anything that is very positive towards moving Sudan towards a peaceful resolution by not delinking humanitarian aid from the political track, as Mukesh has said. We have now this sort of hodgepodge of approaches that don't really make sense. And what it has allowed the belligerent parties to do, chiefly the RSF and the SAF, is to use aid as a political football, is to dictate the terms of aid and thereby also dictate the terms of the peace processes, which is why none of them have gone very far. Now, the Sudanese ambassador to the UN, who takes his orders very much from the Sudanese armed forces and is a partisan actor, is, in right now, taking part in and contributing to famine denial. And it is very much where they want to keep the conversation. They don't want to have a conversation about any peace deals, not while it's still the dry season, not while they hope to take back Khartoum and Jazeera. And they want to use the humanitarian access, the blockages that they're putting in place, the famine denial as a distraction away from the political track. That's why it's essential to delink the two.
All right, Adama, Dieng, your thoughts. Is it essential, as Kholood and Mukesh say, to delink the humanitarian crisis with the political one? And what decisive actions are needed now to create, you think, lasting peace in Sudan?
We need quickly to take a decision. I mean, I'm talking not only about the African Union, but I implore the African Union and the United Nations to take immediate action to really go and protect the Sudanese people. They can stop this war if they want it.
We're going to have to leave it there. It is an important conversation that we're having, and I'm sure that we will keep having in the next few weeks here on Al Jazeera. Thank you so much for joining us, Kholood Khair, Adama, Dieng, and Mukesh Kapila. Thank you for joining us on Inside Story. And thank you, too, for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And, of course, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.